Good evening. I'm Paul Thierman, Director of the Academy Library and Center for the History of Medicine and Public Health. On behalf of my co-organizers, Ilana Kiefer and Mario Rubano, I warmly welcome you to our event, Then and Now, the Opportunities and Challenges of Healthy Aging in New York City. We're glad you've decided to join us this evening as we explore the experiences of older New Yorkers and hear the reflections of historians of aging. Before we turn to our program, I'd like to remind you you may turn on closed captioning for this event, and I'd like to give you a short introduction to the Academy and its Then and Now series. The New York Academy of Medicine was founded in 1847, 175 years ago. Today, NYAM is happy to take on the mantle of Champions for Health Equity, tackling the barriers that prevent everyone from living a healthy life. The Academy Library dates from the very beginning of NYAM. We have since grown into one of the most significant collections in the history of medicine and public health in the country. We invite you to connect with us both digitally and in person. I especially invite you to check out our virtual visits, online introductions to the collections, with our latest one on healthy aging. As part of our 175th anniversary celebration, the Academy Library is taking the lead in organizing events around the theme Then and Now, using the insights of history to shed light on issues in medicine and public health, where the Academy has done and is doing significant work. Tonight is the fourth such Then and Now event. NYAM has promoted healthy aging for almost 40 years. In 1984, the success of NYAM's school health program led to a spin-off program, Project Stay Well. In collaboration with New York City's Department for the Aging, the Academy developed a curriculum and helped train health professionals and volunteers in promoting health in the city's senior citizen centers. Over 20 years later, the Academy took on a major role in the World Health Organization's Global Age-Friendly Cities. New York was designated the first age-friendly city ever. And my colleague Ilana Kiefer can tell you more about that effort. Tonight, in effect, we explore through personal stories how well that commitment is going, hearing the experiences of diverse New Yorkers and the reactions of two historians. I very much look forward to hearing what everyone has to say. You can share your perspectives too, as well as your questions, in the chat feature of Zoom, which we'll turn to in the last part of the program. I also acknowledge the support of the Drs. Barry and Bobbi Coller Programming Fund in the mounting of this event. I now pass the podium to Ilana Kiefer, Director of NYAM's Center for Healthy Aging, who will tell us about the center and introduce her colleague, Mario Rubano.
Thank you, Paul, for your great introduction and for helping to organize tonight's event. As Paul mentioned, my name is Ilana Kiefer, and I am lucky to be the director of NYAM Center for Healthy Aging. At our center, we work to improve the health and well-being of both current and future aging populations. We work on a wide variety of initiatives that impact the lives of the 65+ population and caregivers in New York City, New York State, and across the country. As Paul alluded to, NYAM was instrumental in establishing a public-private partnership in 2007 that resulted in age-friendly NYC, which has catalyzed hundreds of changes throughout the city. We have increased pedestrian safety, showed thousands of businesses how to become age-friendly, and improved transportation and access to recreational and cultural resources for the city's older adults. NYAM also established the age-friendly neighborhoods model in 2010 to develop targeted solutions to neighborhood-level issues and to support emerging grassroots initiatives driven by older people to make their communities more age-friendly. Many of the interviewees you will hear from tonight are active members of these initiatives. And hot off the press, our hard work on the state level has paid off because Governor Hochul just issued an executive order 11 days ago for a New York State Master Plan for Aging, a 10-year cross-sector strategic planning process that will help New York transform the infrastructure and coordination of services for the 65+ disability and caregiving populations, and really all of us. I will now turn over the proverbial microphone to my colleague, Mario Rubano, who is the Policy Associate at the Center for Healthy Aging and the filmmaker, interviewer, and director of tonight's program.
Thank you, Ilana, and thank you, Paul, for your opening remarks, and thank you to all who are able to join us for this evening. So my name is Mario Rubano. I'm a Policy Associate here at the Center for Healthy Aging. To begin, I wanted to provide a quick bit of context for tonight's program before we dive into the main event. So Paul had approached us a while back about doing a Then and Now event that would examine the history of aging in New York City. And so while batting the idea around for a bit, we realized just how much expert knowledge, how much experiential capital was all around us. If you want to know how the city has changed over the years, how it's adjusted to meet the needs of older adults, go speak to those New Yorkers who've changed and aged in the city. And what better city to go looking for honest opinions? It's practically a rite of passage in New York to bear the daily barrage of unsolicited opinions, no matter where you are. But as Paul and Ilana had mentioned, the 2007 Age-Friendly NYC initiative was rooted in a real practical engagement with local communities, and it simply couldn't work otherwise. It may come as no surprise that in order to amplify the voices of older New Yorkers, you need to get out and build relationships with older New Yorkers. And the Center for Healthy Aging carries on this legacy in many ways, none perhaps as closely tied to those origins of the Age-Friendly NYC program than our ongoing Age-Friendly Neighborhood Organization convening. These are monthly meetings that bring together these local organizations, aging service providers, elected officials, and other stakeholders. And these groups, as Ilana had mentioned, they're small, scrappy grassroots groups that are often operated by older adults themselves that work to provide neighborhood-based solutions to emerging challenges. And it's into this network of neighborhood leaders that we tapped to build tonight's event. So we recruited 5 older New Yorkers to sit down for interviews where they could share their perspectives, memories, experiences, and insights on how the city has changed over the years for aging New Yorkers. We structured the interviews according to the foundational framework employed in the age-friendly model worldwide, the 8 domains of livability. So each participant was asked questions that addressed these domains, from transportation to housing to social connection, the built environment. These interviews lasted about an hour apiece, which means you'll only be seeing excerpts of them this evening. We tried to preserve the full context in their responses, but let me tell you, the hardest part of this event was deciding what would end up on the cutting room floor. But that was all totally necessary to allow adequate time for the other aspect of today's program, the analysis, response, and synthesis provided by our guest historians, Dr. Kavita Sivaramakrishnan and Dr. David Troyansky, whom I'd like to invite to the Zoom stage. So Kavita is an associate professor of history at Columbia University and of Socio-Medical Sciences at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. She's a historian of public health and science, focusing on the politics of health and disease crises, as well as life course and aging in the global South. And David is a professor of history at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He's an author of Old Age in the Old Regime, Image and Experience in 18th Century France, and Aging in World History. And as a native New Yorker who in 2005 returned to the city after 30 years away, he's delighted to be bringing his scholarly expertise to an event that is focusing on aging in the city. And now for just one last round of introductions, I invite you all to meet our 5 New Yorkers in our first video sequence. We can roll that footage.
My name is Ronald Buchter. People call me Ron. I live on the Upper East Side of Manhattan in New York City. I've lived in New York my entire life, 74 and a half years. And I'm what you consider a native New Yorker and a real booster for New York City. I love my town.
Hey, my name is Selma Jackson, and currently I'm living in Bedford-Stuyvesant.
My name is Carolyn Stem. I have lived in this neighborhood, the Upper West Side, for 42 years, but I've lived in New York itself for 60 years. I moved here from Ohio when I was 18 to go to college, and I've remained.
Your full name.
Okay, Jose Antonio Ortiz Rivera, all right? I live in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. My wife is a Lower East Side girl. I've been in the neighborhood since around 1985. She's been in the neighborhood, of course, for a very long time.
Hi, I'm Myra Joyce. I currently live in the Riverdale area of the Bronx, but I grew up in the Northwest Bronx. So I've been basically living in New York for 7 decades now.
All right, and with all of our introductions out of the way, we can make our way into the main event. So to kick us off, we're going to begin with the themes of transportation and housing. So we can roll our second video.
When I was first in New York, we didn't have air conditioning. You know, the token was 15 cents on the subway, and that's how I got around most of the time. Subway buses were not that common because if you bought a bus, you got on a bus, you went one way. They didn't even have transfers. I remember when they brought transfers, which was like a revelation. You could go across town, but not having air conditioning in New York City during rush hour and peak times of travel was murder. But thank heaven they do have air conditioning now on buses and subways.
MTA made the recommendation to eliminate the B25 bus. The B25 bus runs on Fulton Street from downtown Brooklyn all the way out to East New York. And the rationale was the A train ran the same length, but there are no elevators on the A train. At that time, there was only one elevator, and that was at J Street, which is where the bus would start. And then from there all the way to East New York, there was no elevator. So it was like, okay, so folks who have challenges with stairs, or folks who have a walker, or folks who have a wheelchair, I guess you're not going to travel. And so my head says, and I don't know this for certain, but the folks who are in management at MTA, I don't think any of them live in the city to make that kind of decision without thinking about how people get around. And it was going through mostly Black and brown communities. And so therefore, again, it was, who cares?
One thing that has changed over the years, what taken place, which I know from my former neighborhood where I grew up in the Amalgamated, it is now recognized as a NORC, which is a naturally occurring retirement community. And so this is a recognition by the city. And they provide people in Newark living at home in their own apartments and are provided with access to healthcare, access to other services.
We participated in assisting seniors and people in the community apply for the numbers that were available as affordable housing within that project. Okay, so there are 300 units in the entire complex, and there were 15,000 applications. Okay, and when you look at it, you say, "Wow, you know, this is how the hell is this going to happen?" You know, what are the chances of a person actually getting something there?
All right. So there's so much to work with there, from the positive developments of improved comfort for riders and the improved capacity, but also some of those glaring holes that have been left in transportation services. So I just want to open that up to either of you to kind of kick off the discussion.
David, do you want to start with reflecting perhaps
Sure.
on the arc of what our interlocutors have been speaking about?
Sure. First of all, on behalf of Kavita and myself, thanks to those real experts. We're not experts on New York City per se, even though I lived half my life in New York City. I work mostly in European history and have written in world history connected with aging. But there are a few things that leap out at me. One is the way in which people identify with the neighborhood. I've lived in such and such a neighborhood for so long. Makes me wonder, when does one become local? And what role does that play in one's idea of one's life, one's identity? I think the fact that people are very quick to say that is important. And we can talk about aging and New Yorkers, but we have to recognize that New Yorkers live in a lot of different places. I guess another is that there's a kind of age awareness. And, I've worked a lot in the 18th and 19th centuries, and one can see a kind of shift towards people becoming aware of their chronological age. But when Ron says he's 74 and a half, I believe him, and it can be documented, I'm sure. That's a big shift when age becomes linked to a number rather than a kind of function or rough idea. Kavita,
I agree, David. And I quickly wanted to add to what Mario, again, to thank everyone at NYAM, and also to add a little bit to my introduction. I'm a proud member of the Columbia Aging Center, the Butler Aging Center. And a lot of the experience I have in aging is also from the colleagues I have there, some of the research that they do. And one of the big questions that we bring in as historians, and I think that's what the interlocutors here bring in, is how do you remember? What is the place of memory of a city? How do you situate yourself in historical time? Do you remember it in a linear way? Do you juxtapose it with other events? So as we go on, I think what's interesting about the interviews is that they all selectively choose specific events in their memory to juxtapose with. And then, of course, I think memory is a kind of privilege. For amongst older people, the group of people we've seen being interviewed are some of the young old, David, as we discussed.
Yeah.
They have the facility and the privilege to remember. So remembrance between short-term memory and long-term memory is an act of a certain kind of confidence and a certain kind of ability. And I think the younger old do, but I think a substantial section of New York's growing older population is also those who are the oldest of old. And this issue of memory and remembering the city, to be able to, I think that population is more in danger of becoming invisible than those who are younger. And as Ron says, people who volunteer, people who can do several things that engage with the city. And I think that's a really vital question here. And I then wanted to quickly engage with your question about age and what does age really mean? And I think this is a group of younger old people who keep mentioning their age. And what's really interesting is that you can be 65 or 70, but have the physiological age of someone much older. Or you don't, if you have been marginalized, or you're a person from a community of color, or you've been stigmatized as a member of the LGBT community, or you've lived on, you've been homeless or experienced incarceration, then I think 65 as a kind of cutoff and as a mention of age is no longer relevant. You're so spent and weathered over time that the city needs to look after your needs before you reach certain kinds of bureaucratic thresholds. So I think that's also something to remember, that people understand their age in so many ways, and we need to be able to give them the facility to remember that. And I think when we speak about infrastructure, which is what our conversation is about today, I think that's the key thing to remember. Is it just about access at a certain age, or is it about, like you pointed out, ability and being able to access some of this infrastructure?
Well, I think, in our own work, we've looked at the way in which this has happened. And of course, bureaucracies, sometimes we think of bureaucracy as this dirty word, but bureaucracy emerges as a way of dealing with very, very large issues and standardizing things. So on the one hand, it's inadequate to say that old age begins at a particular moment. On the other hand, if you have to look at every individual case, institutions can't function. And so when you look at the development of those institutions, they come up with an age. And for some reason, for a very, very long time, no matter the age composition, 60, 65, 70, these are things that keep coming up. I mean, we can go back to the Bible and talk about 70. And it's something that's really kind of remarkable. We can talk about change over time for old people, but we can also recognize there are certain things that probably run across societies and run across time. And it's interesting when we focus on particular places that we sort of tease out what's particular about that place, but then where is there a connection with the rest of the country or the rest of the world?
Right. And I think part of this universal line is, of course, the labor market and retirement, when you want people to be productive and when you don't and you exclude them. So I think that's one of the things. And I thought, in many of the comments that came through, this issue that, what did you think of the issue that Selma raised about the elimination of the B25 bus?
I mean, this shows that when things are done top down, they don't, as she put it, they don't have a clue what's going on. But what struck me even more was the way in which she turned to certain people who might actually do something about it. So it meant turning to a pastor. It meant turning to local politicians. And so if we want to look closely about the experience of aging in particular parts of New York City in particular periods, we might ask, what are those circles that people live in? What kinds of recourse do they have? What kind of agency do they have? And how do those things change over time?
Right. And I think especially whom do you listen to and whom do you hear at the time of a crisis? If there is a hurricane, if there is a heat wave, if you don't regularly put on the radio, or you don't really, you don't meet your pastor, in that case, whom do you listen to, and how do we get that kind of accessibility to you about the changes in infrastructure or access to infrastructure? I think that's one of the questions, especially because she points out this, how she had to deploy her own informal channels and networks. And I thought in that sense, Jose's comment was also very interesting, because he speaks about an issue that's come up again and again, which is that about 65% of older New Yorkers are rent burdened. They have to look for public housing. They are on fixed incomes. And then this brings up the important question. And historically, it's been something that came up in the Great Depression in New York. Do we set up this New York City Housing Authority, which again then became a housing authority that was very selective in whom it allowed in? So the question is, at moments like this, how do we select, how do we make sure that there is, for those who have a fixed income and who want to age in place, how can we make sure that they have access during a housing crisis to certain, to keep their social networks, to retain them, but also to be able to stay without the burden of rent? And I think that he brings out that in a very, very interesting way, I think, the dissonance between the number of applicants and the number of units that are available. And it's been a continuous problem. And even when you offer these housing units, it becomes an enterprise in being extremely selective, saying, I mean, historically, we've known, who are the people who are excluded, those who have irregular work, those who are seen as morally compromised or alcoholic or single mothers, right? So it's a question of, then eligibility to these, to public housing and to access.
Maybe one other historical point to piggyback on what you're saying. You're talking about the importance of the Great Depression in terms of what kind of sort of institutional creativity followed. Maya mentioned the amalgamated co-ops in the Bronx, which date to 1927. So it's even before the Depression. And so New York City has its own particular history. And in that case, it involves union activism and a co-op movement. So again, there are certain national themes and there are certain very local things.
There's actually another example of New York City being kind of at the vanguard of a lot of these changes. Again, to Myra's point of mentioning the NORC model, as the first registered NORC in the country was actually here in New York City back in 1986 at the Penn South houses down in Chelsea. So this idea of innovative ideas to kind of meet these needs, it's kind of rooted here in New York City, which can, at least for me, it makes me a little hopeful for the future that we can continue this type of creative problem solving.
Yeah, to age in place, right, Mario?
Absolutely.
As, especially in a mobile city where we've so often focused on those who can move, to be able to look and understand those who are not able to and who need the resources to kind of age in more solidarity. Which was the other thing I felt that our interlocutors didn't always mention, the intergenerational solidarity, the fact that they have a large number of people they depend on in their families, especially post-COVID. Many of them, especially people of color, are staying with their grandchildren. They are contributing a basic income almost to grandchildren. So, so there's a kind of link between generations, which often when you think of older people as being the only people who are aging alone and in place, we forget that when we help older people, we're helping an entire line and generation of those who are knit with them.
Yeah, it's indicative of a bigger shift away from independence towards interdependence. Yes. That there are certain aspects of life that you do need to manage some sort of dependence on those circles around you. But with an eye on time, I just want to hop on over to our next video. This will be looking at healthcare access and the built environment.
I don't know how far back to go. I remember being a little child living in Brooklyn, and once a year I'd have my cold. The doctor would come to my home with a little black bag. His name actually was William Hertz, Dr. Hertz. And Dr. Hertz would come, and the first thing they would do is give me a penicillin shot in my rear end. And so it's kind of funny. But that was the way medicine worked back in those days. Parents, especially ethnic groups, we were an ethnic group of Jewish people, you didn't go to a hospital until it was time to get ready to die, when you had some chronic illness. Today, it's very different. Over the years, there were more public hospitals and more private physicians.
For me, I think my family was blessed in that my father worked for New York City. He was briefly a police officer, and then he became a bus driver for MTA. But in having that employment, the city had a contract with Health Insurance Plan, or HIP, which is now Emblem Health. The downside of it, although we were cared for by real caring doctors, was that there were very few HIP centers that were integrated. So we went to the Upper Manhattan Health Center maybe about 8 years ago. I was at a concert listening to the music of Billy Strayhorn, who composed with Duke Ellington. And one of the pieces that he composed was a tribute to the Upper Manhattan Health Center. I was so excited about hearing that.
Well, I think the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, caused so many positive changes in construction and outdoor space and in accessibility. And seniors are gaining the benefits from that as well.
The Essex Market, they build this brand new thing that it's not 5-7 years old yet they didn't take into consideration the accessibility to seniors and to handicap going through the doors into the Essex Market. The doors are so heavy, okay, that seniors and handicapped people usually have to wait until someone who is capable open the door for them. And what is troubling is there is a law that says that places such as the Essex Crossing have to provide for that entrance. And they applied and were granted millions of dollars under the condition that they will provide these things.
So again, plenty to work with there. I'm going to toss it over to our guests to dig in a little deeper.
Kavita, do you want to start? Or?
I just will start with a quick comment and then throw it back to you to respond. I mean, I thought it was so interesting to see the level of awareness. And this brings to the fact that they're so aware of what are the sorts of legislation that have been passed, what have they promised versus what's the deficit, what are issues of access at the Essex Market versus not. So I thought that this also tells us a little bit about the power of education. There is a percentage of New Yorkers who have access to this education, but also a percentage who haven't been to high school, who have, who are immigrant populations, who don't know their rights as well. So I was just thinking that one of the big things we need to think about is advocacy. The fact that people need to be aware of policies, to be aware of their rights, and to be able to communicate this not only in English, but we have a substantial percentage of the population that is comfortable only in other languages, which is multicultural in New York City. So how do you reach out to Asian populations, Russian, Indian, and other populations to be able to say, these are your rights, this is what you should ask for? So what impressed me is really to know that even awareness of health clinics, and I loved, we have to talk about the song, of course, that Selma mentioned. But it's just it's a level of comfort of being in a place, and you can be comfortable only with that, with the awareness of that access and education. So I think one of the key things for policy is awareness of that policy.
Yeah, and then that the larger community hear more of the voices we've been listening to. Yeah, even more than us, right? These are the people who are on the ground and know what's going on, know what the challenges are, and right now seem to be dealing with them extremely well. Not everybody is, as you've been pointing out. There are a couple of other things that I noticed. Oh, you mentioned the music, and we should have a sort of shout out to Selma. Yeah. Mentioned the Billy Strayhorn song, and I don't know if she got on here right at the start, but that was the music that was playing at the start of this webinar, which I thought was pretty neat. In any case, Ron talked about his memory of a Brooklyn childhood. It's something I share with him. And he remembers his doctor making house calls and the way the hospital was viewed as something that was a place to go to die. It was sort of alien. And it made me think, first of all, when you look at the history of the hospitals in New York, the ethnicity he described was really important. Religious affiliations were really important. Think about who founds these institutions. Eventually they get to be really big, but what happens as you go from smaller hospitals that people actually do go to, and not just when they're going to die, to much larger ones? what kind, do they identify with these places? Hospitals certainly can do a lot more good now than they did in the past, but sometimes it's not quite as good as the medical industrial complex would like to think. I think again, Selma showed us the importance of memories and how she thought about this Upper Manhattan health group after all these years. That's really important in the way one thinks about what has changed over time and what hasn't.
And I thought that, I mean, perhaps the one thing that is somewhat missing was the fact that we've shifted from the public to increasing privatization of care, right? And that's, like you said, when you spoke about the medical industrial complex, the issue of what was the aim of setting up clinics and hospitals. And Selma kind of alludes to that, the fact that, you know, it was distant, but you could reach and have access. And Ron also refers to access to a primary care physician. And the fact that the privatization and this and the for-profit institutions that have grown, it increasingly means what is the access, especially when you need regularly to go for checkups, when you're someone who needs long-term care. What are the kinds of access you have? And I have to say, in that sense, that at least, especially for older adults who have cognitive decline, for instance, when it's not a question of medical care and treatment, there are older adult centers. So there's been a great deal of improvement. Over the 5 boroughs, we know that in New York City, there are more than, I think, 250, 300 older adult centers. We need to make them all linguistically and culturally accessible. But there's a range of initiatives that have come up. But the question of the hospital and accessing medical care is something else. I think we're kind of nibbling at the edges of trying to get access to, you know, adult centers, memory clinics, a range of other things that we can do. So I feel there are limits to what the local can do. And there is a need for the local to meet a broader arc of policy and more capital investment. And that is the missing kind of piece. What does it really need to be able to bridge that gap?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, we're dealing with top down and bottom up and every which way. And how do they meet? I think one of the things that came up in what Jose was talking about was the problem of implementation. If there's legislation that appears very, very favorable or helpful, or if there are requirements that builders provide a certain percentage of apartments for people who can actually, you know, afford them. There's this question of what is being created and then how is that being implemented? I think this is not a new problem, but it's certainly a current one.
And I quickly wanted to add that when Ron says that people will go to the hospital to die, we're also speaking of a point when life expectancy has really changed. If being the oldest of old meant you were 65 or in your 60s, but we know that New York pulls ahead of even the national life expectancy by about 2.5 years. I mean, we're proud of that. But it really means that we are speaking of people who will need to access that care before they die. However much, you know, health policy experts will tell us that we are going to try and compress morbidity till the last 3 months. If you keep yourself alert and active and keep exercising, you can postpone it. But there is no way in which this population, this rapidly growing population of older New Yorkers, can do without needing to access that care. It's not a place to go and die, because I think you are going to live 2-3 decades more of your life. So we have expanded life expectancy and it pulled it from the middle to the later years by about 25-30 years. So I think we have to change the architecture of how we're looking at healthcare services based even on that knowledge, which I think is more recent over the last few decades versus even the 50s and 60s.
Absolutely. And to your earlier points, Kavita, of the development of bureaucracies and advocacy as well, these stories also demonstrate that civic engagement, even after a victory like the ADA, that civic engagement doesn't stop, that it needs to continuously be refined to better meet these needs as the world continues to develop, as systems get even more complex and more just challenging to kind of weave your way into. Such as something else that jumps out at me is that you don't stop once you get something like the ADA. You refine it even further.
Yeah. And that the ADA was preceded by all these White House conferences on aging and so much else that networks of NGOs have historically built up as a kind of web across the US. And they've used the kinds of sociological and biological evidence that's come together and translated that to policymakers. So you're absolutely right. The one legislation that is won is just the platform to build on more, and often for cities to take that up and say, what else can we do with it? And New York needs to constantly, therefore, compare itself to what other cities are doing.
Yeah.
All right. So with that, I think we can move on to our next section. We're going to be watching responses to the categories of social inclusion and what is viewed as the most significant change over the course of their lifetimes.
Well, again, if I look back at my childhood and my grandparents, I didn't think of them as the same part of society as my parents that went to work and had occupations and raising family. They were just the elders of the family, okay? Because since 1950, let's say, which is 70-something years ago, if you take a look at actuarial charts, that people live a longer life. And because of that, they have longer careers and essentially stay active. And here I am, 74. I'm retired, and yet I do a lot of volunteer work. And not everybody's volunteerism is not for everyone, but it's a way of staying in the mix. And so because of that, and even we have politicians, the last number of politicians, look at our president, he's in his 70s. A lot of people in the Senate and Congress in their later years. So people take a look at all of that and they have a lot more respect for the knowledge base of these people and the fact that they're quite active.
I think ever since New York City adopted the age-friendly initiative, more attention has been given to the elder population. They weren't as prominent in the lives of politicians and people, but since the introduction of age-friendly, where things started to change and voices were starting to be heard of the older people.
This was my introduction at the age of 10 to major construction in New York, and that was the Cross Bronx Expressway. And what happened, I mean, I mentioned that I grew up in the Bronx, and I don't recall my living in the Bronx became living in the South Bronx until after the Cross Bronx Expressway was constructed. But what it did was it removed people from the neighborhood that folks never got to see again. I was in elementary school, and friends that I had made by the 5th grade, we left school in June, and when we met back in September, they weren't there, and I had no idea where they went or how to get in touch with them or anything. And so it was really, to me, devastating in that loss.
All right. So what conversation about a changing New York City would be complete without mentioning Robert Moses, arguably the most consequential figure in 20th century New York. So no surprise there that his name was mentioned. Kavita, David,
Yes.
want to take it off?
I think it was fascinating. David, we've discussed this, I think, as historians, both of us, in terms of Robert Caro's work, the power broker, Robert Moses,
Right.
as an influential public planner. I think, I mean, let me start before Moses. I thought I'd start with what Ron was saying. So he said that he does a lot of volunteer work in terms of needing to stay in the mix. And I thought that was interesting because it also takes for granted that to stay in the mix, you need to do a certain kind of volunteering, which he feels helps him to kind of build social capital. And we all know with the social capital studies that that kind of bridging and bonding capital helps you to stay younger. It helps to prevent a range of other conditions, especially social isolation and loneliness. But I was also thinking that it's so to stay in the mix is kind of very flexibly defined. Everyone volunteers in different ways in New York. Some people will volunteer to larger civic agencies. If you're parts of the Korean and Chinese and South Asian population, then you volunteer often within the family and within the community. And that is volunteering too. Though officially it's never recognized as volunteering, but you do. And the luxury of volunteering comes out of having a certain kind of social security or pension or whatever allows you to be able to make for that leisure time. So I think we have to recognize that we have to enable people to be able to volunteer, to make sure that they don't face that kind of loneliness and social isolation. And I just saw the happiness when he was talking about staying in the mix. And I thought how important it is to be able to recognize that we need to be able to allow a range of populations to be able to do that. So I quickly wanted to first comment on Ron and then hand it back to David, and then we can reflect on the others.
Sure. The volunteerism, it reminded me of a really good study of old age homes and hospitals in Quebec in the middle of the 20th century, a historian named Aline Charles, who writes not only about the older people who reside in those retirement homes, but the volunteers who are close to the same age. And so the way in which old age is represented by two interacting but different populations. I think one of the other things that struck me in what Ron was talking about was the importance of grandparents to grandchildren and vice versa. There's a great book about the history of grandparenthood by a French historian who describes the 19th century as the great era of grandparenthood. It's not as if there weren't grandparents before, but there are a lot more, and they're more visible by the time you get to the 19th century and certainly the 20th. And I can't tell you how many other historians and sociologists and gerontologists have admitted either privately or publicly that, yeah, they got into this field because of the impact of their grandparents. And I'm one of those people. It certainly had an impact on me. And I can also say that I've recently learned that it's really great to be a grandparent. In any case, I think that's something we should pay attention. Kavita, you were talking about the sort of informal help, whether it's institutionalized or not. And I think one of the things we haven't said a lot about is the kind of residential patterns. What kind of co-residence is there between an older generation and maybe their adult children? How has that changed over time? That's something that historians have written about. And they've written about relationship as sometimes not all that solidaristic, but sometimes really, really fraught. And sometimes we may idealize the past and think, well, everyone somehow honored their elders. I think a lot of the historical literature would tell us, no, we shouldn't look at the world with such rosy lenses. But that relationship is certainly an important one. And I too was struck by, when Selma talks about the Cross Bronx Expressway, and I was thinking not just about how jarring it would have been for children, but how jarring it would have been for older people who were used to a certain kind of neighborhood and maybe used to it for a very long time. And then it changes. And then the car takes over with all that implies.
So I was thinking that's right, that when we think about aging, including in New York, instead of seeing older people as one one separate constituency if we link them with the relationships they have with their grandchildren, with the fact that when you transfer money or funds or any kinds of resources to older people, they often share them. And that sharing between generations is something there's very little data on. And it's important to bring it out so that we see old age and aging policies as not being a separate issue, but being very deeply linked to whatever we do for younger people. So I think this, what we are talking about, these informal networks between older people, and then the question, including in cash transfer programs to older people, and this reminds me of what you're saying about your grandparents, is whom do you give the money to grandfathers or grandmothers? You know, who are the people who end up supporting the grandchildren and to make sure that their nutritional levels are good, that they're sent to school, that they get their vaccinations. So I think there's a huge amount there that's happening. And that's not recognized sufficiently by policymakers. And regarding what Selma was saying, we know that the story and the fall and the rebirth of the Bronx is all about the Cross Bronx Expressway. And in Caro's book, there's this entire section on the destruction of the East Tremont, which is Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe who were basically working class families who, including older people who would play cards on benches, often on Southern Boulevard. That's the way he describes it. And the loss of that, and the loss of access to go on the E1 line to be able to go to the garment district, it was such a huge blow. And at the cost of an expressway such as this, I think it really brings out what she experienced as a child. But you also realize that in there are the memories of older people who were living there then, and whose voices are often silenced, because this kind of recollection you can do of your childhood, but we almost have no records of what they experienced at that time of the seniors who lived in areas like East Tremont, and what they experienced in terms of their social solidarity and networks. And I thought that's a really important part. And of course, Carolyn's insights on the NYAM Center she's in the NYAM Center for Healthy Aging. And I thought that what she mentioned, particularly about the age-friendly neighborhoods, the need particularly to have targeted interventions like there are at the neighborhood level in Manhattan and Brooklyn, I think that's just remarkable. It's a set of unique interventions, which I feel hold New York out to be an example. But I do feel that there are lots of models in Asia, in places, in societies that have aged differently or aged before, like Japan, in terms of how generations can live together, how you can have policies that benefit two generations, homes that can be, architects that innovate, allow older people and younger people to live side by side. So I feel these are models that we haven't looked at enough. And these are kind of innovations. While we have some innovations to offer, I think we also have innovations from other places to learn from.
Yeah. Oh, are we going to look at questions from the chat?
Yeah, I was just going to suggest we open up our Q&A section while we have some time remaining on the clock. All right, so we have one. Elaine Larson says, thank you for this thoughtful dialogue. One of the major reasons why the interviewees mentioned their age, as noted by Dr. Sivaramakrishnan, may be because our American culture, unlike many other global cultures, tends to disregard elders and focus on youth. This may be a result in part from the loss of the extended family. How would you recommend we take full advantage of the experience and hopefully wisdom of elders to improve public health and quality of life?
David, do you have thoughts on that?
That's a big question. I think it's events like this and the activities of the institutions that NYAM is engaging with, these are ways of doing such things. I think the idea that, it's often observed that American culture really values youth and does not at all value age. I think it's kind of a mixed thing, and I think there is a danger in idealizing what's happened in either in a more distant past or in other cultures. There's all kinds of stress between generations. But certainly there are the things to be learned. Kavita was talking about certain East Asian and South Asian models. A couple of years ago, she was in my class at Brooklyn College, and we were talking to some students. I was teaching a course about aging, and many of the students were either themselves recent immigrants or children of immigrants, and they were really interested in this question because they'd grown up with a kind of belief in a certain reverence for age and the wisdom of age, and they thought for sure they weren't going to change their practice as they become increasingly Americanized. And I said, okay, we can check back in 40 years and see what, I mean, they can, I can't, but at what's actually happened. But it's a good question. And I think there's connected to this is a kind of ageism that some scholars have written about, that there's the way in which we depict old people, the way we talk about old people, the kind of jokes that can be told, but about no other group of people. This is something that is a kind of collective work for all of us. I realize I'm not giving a very good answer to that question because it's a really hard one to answer, but maybe Kavita, you can do better.
No, I agree. It's a difficult question. That's why it's a very good question. And I want to kind of summarize this along with some of the others. I feel that it's important that, I mean, I think America is, and like many other societies, it's been particularly youth-centered. When I think about remembering when I thought about America living in Asia, we thought about rock and roll, we thought about pop, everything that was youthful that America was exporting. It seemed to be like the beacon of everything that was young and youthful. You didn't think about older people in America. But I think that's also because of a society that's been so oriented towards immigration and an economy that is so centered on labor and productivity. Even today, people feel guilty if they're not active enough. And how can you can't be active enough unless you've had the kind of nutrition and health and everything that goes infrastructure that allows you to do all of that. So America fosters this notion, I think, not only amongst older people, but I think in the US, this feeling of guilt of individual responsibility when social structures have been so deeply responsible, whether it's race or ethnicity or so many other things that have been responsible for the situation we are in. So I feel even intergenerational relationships could be very good. But if you don't have a society that allows them or enables them to flourish, and if you only have a working lifestyle that requires younger people to be at work all day, then how would you, I don't think anyone does not want to go and care for their grandparents or visit older people. I think that you have to enable people to have that kind of support. So I would really say that a post-industrial society like the US, we can't really compare it accurately to societies that are possibly industrializing or are partly developed in different ways, where you have a certain kind of leisure, you have more agrarian communities. But even there across the world, people are constantly migrating. So there are what I think with globalization, there's not that much of a difference. There's such a flattening of the world. Mm-hmm. I think in global cities across the world, in China and India, for instance, including in South Africa, you have some of the largest populations of youth who've migrated from villages. There are villages that are bereft of younger people, where older people and children are just left behind. So I think it's a system of labor and capital, which forces people also to focus on youth. And we have to try deliberately to try and focus on other social priorities. So I think cultural tendencies are one thing, but how much does the economy and how do social structures allow us or enable us to be kind to older people, to see the relationships across generations, I think is the important thing. And I also want to shout out to something else we were speaking about, which is elder abuse, which is that we have to remember that older people who are often isolated, who are not looked after properly in communities, we need to have the sorts of alertness to be able to identify across the world, whether it's in the US or Africa or India or other places. Even within families, the loneliness and mistreatment of older people is quite high. So we need to make sure that we have ways in which they can communicate, both to be able to ask for strength, but also to be able to police that kind of abuse. And I think that's one of the things which New York has been quite good in terms of helpline. And that's where local agencies and communities are really important, I think. And that's really the strength of coming back to NYAM. Many of the programs NYAM has been involved in. The empowering of local communities, particularly as we've seen with age-friendly neighborhoods. So I want to shout out to that. And I think, yeah.
Yeah. I think there are a number of comments in the chat that we should at least allude to. There's discussion of migration. We could talk about migration across borders. We can also talk about the great migration of African Americans from the South to northern cities,
Yes.
and what happens later on as those people age. But then there are also people who are talking not only about intergenerational relations, but also about single people who age, and what kind of life are they living? What are their particular challenges that they face? Are there ways in which they construct social networks that are different from the social networks of those who have these traditional sorts of kinship relations? I think there was a big shift in some of the literature on aging in gay communities when you have the possibility of marriage and children and multiple generations and so on. And so the literature kind of shifted to pay attention to what was going on as things were changing fairly rapidly. There's a lot in the chat, there are a lot of good comments and questions.
To think of modern families and not the average kind of, heterosexual family. And I think there have been studies to show that there are different kinds of social capital between members of LGBT communities in terms of migration to areas where they face less stigma, where there's a social acceptance, retirement communities where they feel accepted. But that also means that if you're not able to retire and live in the so-called mainstream, it raises questions about what this mainstream is and how limited it is and for whom. So I think, again, it raises issues about how we can be much more inclusive when we talk about families. And the modern family is not the kind of family that is there in the literature 20 years, 30 years ago. And that transition has to appear in policy as well, I think.
Yeah.
Well, beautifully put. With an eye on time, we're just a couple minutes over. So I wanted to thank our special guests for the evening, David and Kavita. And I'd like to invite Paul from the NYAM Library back to the stage to send us off.
Thanks, Mario. And let me extend my thanks to David and Kavita for their wonderful insights, to Mario for shepherding this program through and moderating tonight's event, to my colleague Ilana Kiefer at NYAM Center for Healthy Aging, and to everyone who attended tonight. Be on the lookout for a note announcing the event recording, and please join us for future NYAM events as we seek to understand and address the challenges that prevent everyone from living a healthy life. Thank you and good night.